So we can have a look at this in a bit more of a 3D picture, but it's the same four-layered structure. Now we know the serosa is connective tissue made of collagen on the outside. We know beneath the serosa is the muscularis made of smooth muscle. There's the longitudinal muscle on the outside and the circular muscle on the inside of the muscularis. Beneath the muscularis is the submucosa, and we can see here there's actually nerve cells. So these in yellow are actually nerve cells. There's blood vessels to take away the absorbed food, for example in the ileum. And there's also lymphatic capillaries. So this one in green might be a lymphatic capillary if this was the ileum. Now the very inside layer is called the mucosa. We know there's epithelial cells that line the very inside of the mucosa. And we know if it's, for example, the ileum, they're going to secrete mucus. If they're goblet cells, to protect the lining, the epithelial lining of the ileum. We know the space inside the gut is called the lumen. So these are the two longitudinal muscles. Muscularis muscles, the longitudinal muscle on the outside, the circular muscle on the inside. Now, we know if we go back to the serosa very briefly, we're going to put down the main jobs. Well, it reduces friction with other internal organs and it protects the gut wall, because we know connective tissue is very tough, it's very fibrous, very strong. Now, we know the muscularis has waves of contraction called peristalsis to propel the bolus of food in a single direction through the entire length of the gut. Now, if you don't have enough fiber in your diet, what can happen is you don't get this stimulation of the inner layers of the gut wall. So fiber is very important to kind of push against the gut wall and stimulate peristalsis. So what happens if you haven't got enough fiber in your diet is quite often the lack of peristalsis, so the food kind of gets stuck, the bolus of food gets stuck within some part of the digestive tract, and therefore you can become constipated. So a good thing to do if you ever get constipated is to have more fiber in your diet, because it can stimulate peristalsis. Okay. Now the submucosa underneath the muscularis, we know it's got some connective tissue in there. It's got blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. Nerves help coordinate peristalsis from the muscularis. We know the mucosa, it secretes mucus, hence the name, protects the epithelial cells of the, for example, the ileum. We also know there are glands that secrete certain digestive enzymes, things like amylase, lipase, and some proteases. Now, if we look at the longitudinal muscle here, what we can actually see is, like we said on the previous diagram, it is in this orientation along the length of the muscularis. So in cross section, the ends of these muscle fibers look like little circles. Now, the circular muscle is orientated in this way, surrounding the muscularis, which is why it doesn't look like little circles from the end. It looks like long threads of muscle tissue. So it's coordinated movement. When there's no peristalsis, the longitudinal muscle on the outside has contracted, the circular muscle is relaxed. When we get at point X, maybe this point here, point X, peristalsis, we know the longitudinal muscle contracts. The longitudinal muscle relaxes and the circular muscle does the opposite and it contracts at that point. Now that will last for a very short period of time and then it reverts back to its original state. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the duodenum. Now the duodenum we know is the first 20 centimeters of the small intestine, and we know inside the duodenum we will find a material called bile. Now bile is synthesized by the liver and it's stored in the gallbladder, a little kind of green sac sitting outside the liver, and that gallbladder is connected to the duodenum via the bile duct. Now we know any duct is made of cuboidal epithelium. So even the pancreatic duct, the bile duct, these epithelial cells are kind of cube shaped and they form like a little tube known as a duct. Now the bile has a number of properties. It's called amphipathic. So the molecule, the bile salts, are both hydrophilic on one side and hydrophobic on the other side. and that's why they can emulsify big droplets of oils and fats into thousands of tiny little droplets. So emulsification of oil droplets is the result of bile or bile salts. That increases the surface area because we get thousands of smaller little oil droplets as opposed to a larger big droplet. So we've got a much bigger surface area. And because we've got a much larger surface area, the lipase enzymes that are secreted from the pancreas, the pancreatic lipase enzymes, have a larger surface area to work on, so they can start to break down or hydrolyze the triglycerides into 3 fatty acids and glycerol. Now, not only does bile help emulsify large oil droplets into thousands of smaller droplets by lowering the surface tension and creating a larger surface area collectively, it's also alkaline. So it helps to neutralize the acidic food, the acidic bolus of food coming out of the stomach via the pyloric sphincter. So on this picture, we can actually see the gallbladder and the bile duct. Now we know this big organ here is the liver, and we know that is where the bile salts are actually synthesized. Now the liver's got lots of different jobs, things like detoxification of the blood, the breakdown of alcohol, it stores glucose or excess glucose as glycogen, etc. But it also makes bile. Now the bile is stored within the gallbladder here, and it's released down the bile duct into the duodenum. And we know the duodenum is the first 20 centimeters of the small intestine, like we just said. We know that bile salts emulsify larger fat droplets or oil droplets into many smaller ones by reducing the surface tension of these droplets. And collectively, with all these thousands of small droplets of oil, we know lipase has a larger surface area to work on. But the pancreas as well is another gland. It's an endocrine gland because the pancreas actually makes hormones like insulin and glucagon, both involved in regulating blood glucose concentrations, but it also makes digestive enzymes. So some of the cells of the pancreas, maybe down this end of the pancreas, they actually synthesize different enzymes which get released down the pancreatic duct down into the duodenum. Now these include things like pancreatic lipase. So we know the bile salts are going to emulsify oil droplets. They make thousands of smaller oil droplets with a larger surface area. Pancreatic lipase is an enzyme that catalyzes hydrolysis of the ester bonds in a triglyceride. It releases fatty acids and glycerol, and they can then be absorbed across the wall of the ileum a little bit further down into the lacteal. Now we also have pancreatic amylase that's secreted as part of pancreatic juice into the duodenum, and we know this is going to hydrolyze glycosidic bonds, alpha 1 to 4 glycosidic bonds in starch, because starch is made of amylose and amylopectin. Now there's also an endopeptidase called trypsin, which is secreted by the pancreas as part of pancreatic juice, but it's actually made and secreted as an inactive form called trypsinogen. Now it is inactive because if this was an active peptidase that break down proteins and it was inside cells, it would cause damage to the proteins inside the cells to actually make the enzyme. So it has to be secreted in an inactive form. Now the other part of pancreatic juice contains another enzyme called enterokinase. And it's this enzyme that cleaves off a portion of trypsinogen to release the active trypsin inside the duodenum. So inside the duodenum we have digestion or hydrolysis of triglycerides, we have hydrolysis of starch to release maltose, and we have hydrolysis of proteins to release shorter polypeptide chains. Now we know pancreatic juice is alkaline to help neutralize the acidic food from the stomach. We know bile salts are also alkaline to do the same job. And also we know in the wall of the duodenum, in the submucosa of the duodenum, are glands called Brunner's glands. So these Brunner's glands in the wall of the duodenum, in the submucosa, we can put that there, submucosa, they secrete an alkaline fluid, a mucus-like fluid, and what that does, it also neutralizes the acid food coming from the stomach, but it also provides a protective layer. So protective layer over the epithelial cells that line the duodenum, and it stops these epithelial cells being digested by the enzymes released from the pancreas, the pancreatic juice enzymes. Now, when we look at the ileum, which is the main part of the small intestine, whereby we get most or 90% of digestion occurring. So most of the digestion of your food occurs in the ileum, and then we get absorption of those breakdown products. So there's two roles of the ileum: most of the digestion of food and virtually all of the absorption of the important molecules or ions released from that digestion. Now, the inside wall of the ileum, you can see here in this top picture, it's actually folded like this, folded inwards. Now, these are not villi, these are just folds of the wall of the ileum, and that increases the surface area for absorption of products of digestion. So if you look at this picture here on the left, you can actually see these are not villi, these are just folds here of the wall of the small intestine. They're just folds. Now, if you look a little bit closer, you should be able to see there's extensions of the inside of the ileum wall, and it's these that are the villi. So you can see here, these kind of projections increase the surface area again for secreting mucus, for secreting enzymes, and also for absorbing the products of digestion. So we've got folding of the wall of the ileum. We've got many, many millions of villi that extend from each of the folds to further increase the surface area. So this structure here on the right hand side is a single, say here, single villus. So this is one of these extensions. Now you can see the cells that are one cell thick that form a tissue that lines each villus are called epithelial cells. And if we look at these epithelial cells in a little bit more detail, what we can see is they're specialized. They've got a brush border of microvilli. So if I just draw a very simple picture of this, these are the microvilli. So the villus is this elongated structure that projects from the wall of the ileum. And the epithelial cells on the outside of the villus are specialized. They're called microvilli, projections from them. So it's just a projection of the cell membrane of these epithelial cells. And that forms the lining of the ileum. Now, you can see here there are actually specialized epithelial cells called goblet cells that we'll look at in a bit more detail next. Now, these are cells that secrete and store mucus. And they also, when they release the mucus, it's got several jobs because it does protect the epithelial lining of the ileum from digestion with the hydrolytic enzymes. Now, inside the villus, we can see a very, very rich blood capillary network. So blood capillary network. And within these blood vessels, we get absorbed glucose, absorbed amino acids, and absorbed ions. So all the glucose that's been digested, all the amino acids, and all the ions get absorbed into the blood across the wall of the ileum. Now, anything hydrophobic like fatty acids, they can't be digested and absorbed straight into the bloodstream because they wouldn't dissolve in the plasma of the blood. So fatty acids, for example, get absorbed into this green structure in the middle of the villus called the lacteal. Actually do that in green. So this structure here is called the lacteal that extends up through the villus, virtually to the top of the villus inside it. And that is a lymphatic capillary. So the fatty acids that get absorbed into the lacteal, they get packaged in what are called lipoproteins, small spheres of phospholipid bilayer. So inside that you've got fatty acids and triglycerides, and eventually these liposomes will be transferred back into the bloodstream, because we know things like high density lipoproteins and low density lipoproteins are responsible for transporting different types of triglyceride, and we tend to get more saturated triglycerides, saturated fatty acids in the low density lipoproteins, as well as a bit more cholesterol. So if we look at the villus in a bit more detail, we can see the epithelial lining of the villus here on the outside. Now, this picture in the middle does show a specialized epithelial cell called a goblet cell, and it's this goblet cell that makes and secretes mucus. So we can see here in a bit more detail, if I draw in the cell membrane in red of this cell, it's like this. So that's the cell membrane, and the mucus is secreted into this pocket here, and then it gets secreted into the lumen of the ileum. So that's a zoomed in picture at the bottom of a goblet cell. So in this picture we can see the epithelial cells that line the ileum. We can also see the specialized goblet cells. Now, if we have a look at a single epithelial cell here, we can see it's a columnar shape. So we call the epithelial cells that line the ileum columnar epithelium. Now, obviously this is a goblet cell here, and it secretes this mucus. So in this kind of pocket, the mucus is stored, and then it gets released into the lumen of the ileum. Now, what the mucus does, it has a couple of jobs. Firstly, it kind of sits on the outside of the epithelial lining, and it provides a protective surface. So a protective surface to prevent the epithelial cells being digested by the hydrolytic enzymes that would be present in the lumen of the ileum. The mucus also helps to lubricate the bolus of food, because we know that's going to pass down the ileum, so this way, by peristalsis, and peristalsis occurs because of the contraction of the circular muscle and the relaxation of the longitudinal muscle on the outside of the muscularis. So as the food is propelled down the ileum by peristalsis, it's lubricated by some of the mucus secreted by the goblet cells along the length of the ileum.